Hello everyone and welcome to the Shadow of Revan Vanguard review, the Vanguard slash Powertech, because both these classes, we've got Vanguard and Powertech. Of course, the Flavor of the Month class that many re-rolled, not just the Flavor of the Month, the Flavor of the Expansion class. The Vanguard had arguably its best ever expansion. 3.0 was good to it. Vanilla was quite good as well. They were really good in PvP. The Vanguards and Powertechs were awesome in PvP. Again, I used to PvP as a sniper and as a Sage healer. And I remember those bad times, bad times, especially as a Sage healer, getting pulled away from the group, stunned, and then burned to death by them Powertechs. The glory days returned as the Vanguard excelled, really. The PvP, they were okay. I mean, they were pretty decent in PvP. Still, they came back to being a PvP destruction machines. They returned to that, but PvE is where they really shined. They shone so bright in PvE. And this was because their DPS spec was very mobile, okay? Being the most mobile tactic spec was just the single target beast. It had mobility, it had very good burst, its sustainability was maybe a bit questionable, but it was decent sustainability. It had and it of course had very good survivability as well, making it very viable as, you know, a decent melee DPS that wouldn't just fall over, aka a Marauder, really, or even a Guardian. But yeah, Marauders and Guardians, they were jealous, and a lot of people who played Marauders certainly re-rolled. So this was the Flavor of the Month re-roller. If you rolled a Vanguard for the first time in this expansion, congratulations! You saw a bandwagon and you thought, I'm jumping on that bandwagon. I know why you did it. You saw them Vanguards, you saw their DPS numbers, and you went, shit, I want on that bandwagon. I don't blame you. I don't blame you. To be honest with you, I don't really blame you. They also had one of the best sort of raid defensive cooldown abilities. They had, of course, Sonic Rebounder, which if you were raiding as a Vanguard was a requirement. Okay, it was a requirement, regardless of whether you were a tank or whether you were a tank or DP. I was gonna say healer there. You nearly said healer Vanguard. Yeah, screw it, Vanguard. They could heal themselves with their shoulder missiles as well. That was another utility that you could have. Yeah, they were healer Vanguards. So yeah, you could take the Sonic Rebounder, regardless of the role you were playing. Very useful. It was essentially a Saber Reflect for your raid. And if all the raid was bunched up, like they were Underlurker for the Cross, awesome. As a healer, we loved playing. We loved it when a Vanguard came along, basically. If you weren't into single target burst damage, you had, of course, Plasmatech, or Pyrotech as it was known. If you were a Powertech, awesome for cleave, the best cleave spec in the game. After the Sages got nerfed, after those TK Sages got nerfed, and the balanced Sages, well, they were okay actually for AoE, but the best cleave in the game. It was so much fun, especially as a Powertech. You just burn shit, basically. If you're a pyromaniac that loves to just set things on fire, get your flame shower, which didn't spread your flame shower, but it would jump automatically when a certain enemy died. It would jump to the next enemy, and the time remaining would transfer across. You also had a dot spread with your flamethrower, which was nice. That was added in patch 3.2. The removal of what was it called, full auto or unload, didn't really affect us hugely overall. I mean, it was a slight loss, you could argue, but I mean, it mostly, when we had filler, essentially, it was used for energy management, really, but we generally just replaced that, or I replaced it anyway, with Mortar Volley. Generally was the best way to do it, because you had your, can't remember what the cooldown is called, I think it was Thermal Override it was called on the Powertech, where it would basically make your next ability cost no heat or cost no energy. And what you did was you wanted a channeled ability, because channeling full auto for 3 seconds meant that you were regenning energy, because of course it didn't cost any energy to channel full auto. So over that 3 seconds you were regenning a good bit of energy. So again, it was very useful. Of course we lost full auto, So what we had to do was use Mortar Volley, generally is what we use. Mortar Volley could be part of your main rotation if you were Pyro. Or should we say Death from Above, could be part of your rotation if you were a Pyro spec. But again, it was always nice to save that. So energy management was a bit of a pain, which is why kind of tactics wound up being the way to go if you're just doing single target. If you're doing any sort of cleave, Pyro was awesome. But either way, both specs viable. It was one of the few classes, actually, where both damage specs were actually viable for raiding or PvP. Again, PvP, you want to be the burst damage in PvP, go tactics. You want to be the, you want to cleave if everyone's bunched up in PvP, then, you know, you can take Pyro. Pyro was perfectly viable in PvP. Both specs viable. And we'll move on to the last but very not least spec, the Shield Specialist, the Vanguard tank, which was again a staple tank in 4.0. You could argue between them and the Shadow over which one was actually the best tank. In terms of mobility, the Shadow had a slight edge, but the Vanguard makes up for that little bit less mobility by just being a fucking badass, okay? Again, a lot of people, as a tank spec, it probably is the most boring and lacks a bit of depth as a tank spec, you would argue, because the mitigation is mostly passive. Okay, your Shadow is a lot more involved as a tank, and you're a lot more involved in your active mitigation. The Vanguard tends to be your passive mitigation, and your active mitigation comes from things that you were using anyway to generate threat. Things like your Stock Strike, High Impact Bolt, which procced your Energy Blast, which again would increase your shield rating. You had a lot of passives as a Vanguard. You had a lot of passives that, again, and these things that were just naturally integrated into your rotation. Certainly if you're starting out as a tank, then the Vanguard is an excellent choice. It is an excellent choice going forward, certainly if you want to learn the tanking role, because you don't really have to worry a lot about your mitigation, just worry about your threat and your positioning of the boss, and your mitigation generally takes care of itself, mostly. So you don't really have to worry about those things. If you're, again, we say that, as a new player who wants to get into tanking, go for a Vanguard, okay? There was a question on the forums I saw, is which tank is best PvE for a new player? Simple answer, Vanguard Powertech. Okay, it's a very, very straightforward answer. It's simple to play. The problem is it just lacks depth. I mean, that's the big problem with it. The rotation is like, right, I've hit all my threat things, they're all on cooldown. What do I do now? It's like, well, should I be doing something? You always think, I really should be doing something here, and it's like, what am I going to do? You know, there's something else I should be doing here. Surely that's not it, really, because you're like halfway through your rotation and like, it feels like there's something missing from the rotation. It's kind of hard to put your finger on, like, it's like, you know, because, you know, as a Juggernaut, you've got Scream to use for your mitigation, you've got Ravage when you've got nothing else to press, nothing else mitigation-wise, you've got your Crushing Blow on cooldown. You know, you've got your Aegis Assault, which again will help out your damage reduction. You get a small damage reduction from Aegis Assault. And of course, your main mitigation comes from your... it's not Revenge, it's Retaliation. Revenge is the buff I think you get, but Retaliation is where most of your mitigation comes. And Retaliation and Scream, very, very nice for your mitigation generally. And of course, Smash as well for the accuracy debuff as well. So these kinds of things, there's always something to press as a Juggernaut tank. There's always like something there. There's always something to do. If there's nothing to do, you just use Ravage, really. Although next expansion, Ravage is going to be part of our mitigation rotation, because it's going to give us a defensive buff. As a Vanguard, you're like I fired off me proc for me big, what was it? I can't remember what it's called. The Ion Cannon, the replacement for that. I can't even remember that. Channels twice as fast, which is useful. And again, the proc resets the cooldowns. It's very good for sort of cleaving things. You got your Harpoon, of course, as a tank, which is again very, very useful for pulling enemies in for AoEing, and generates a really high amount of threat as well. So yeah, I mean, the Vanguard is a very good tank, but then again, you're like, what should I press here? That was when you kind of pressed full auto. You were like, I got nothing to press. I don't have to move. I'm going to hit full auto. Maybe now you kind of press death from above, but it is on a longer cooldown now. So you're like, you know what? I'm like, what do I press now? And you're waiting for your stock strike and your high impact bolt and your energy blast to come off cooldown. You're like, kind of boring. You could argue it's a bit boring. You do also have hold the line as a Vanguard, which is very, very good. And you can also buff its speed again. They were speed demons. That's what gave them really nice mobility. Also, they had a lot of decent ranged abilities. If you remember back in Scum and Villainy, when we were kiting the, what was it called again? Sunder. The Vanguards and the Shadows were awesome at that, especially the Vanguards with their ranged abilities were really, really nice. And of course in the current tier, very melee unfriendly. If you are going to go a melee class in the current raid tier, it was always best to pick the Vanguard. They were really very, very good in terms of the mobility. There are very few abilities that they had to channel. As a tank and as Pyro, you did have one ability to channel. It was your flamethrower or your whatever, pulse cannon or ion cannon. I can never remember what they had. It's one of them, you know, it's your flamethrower, we'll call it. I can never remember what that's called, to be honest with you. I know it gets replaced as a tank. But yeah, you were that kind of, that badass tank that, you know, you could take a bit of damage as well because your mitigation was reasonably high. Your passive mitigation was very, very good. So they were very forgiving on mistakes, very good for new players. So there was no real massive downside to the Vanguard. It's hard to think of where did we really struggle as a Vanguard, and there's no real fight. You could argue maybe Torque was maybe a bit of a struggle because of the fire, but you know, we had our hold the line, of course, which made us awesome. Our passive speed boost, we could increase the duration of hold the line, which got us moving really fast. We could increase the speed boost of hold the line, and we could increase our general speed boost, so we could have the speedy Vanguard, which was useful in certain fights where we had to be in certain positions at the right time, or we had to target switch. Now in 4.0 in Knights of the Fallen Empire, it hasn't been revealed officially yet, but the data mining, most of the data mining stuff has been accurate so far, so we're safe to assume that all the Vanguards are getting Storm, which is very, very good, actually. We've got a gap closer at last. Really, I mean, the kind of hold the line buff, speed buff, kind of acted as our temporary gap closer, which was alright, and we did have a few ranged abilities, but Storm, yes, we can lose very little uptime on fights like Sword Squadron is going to be very, very good. Sword Squadron, where we have to switch from Unit 1 to Unit 2, again, we can just do what the Marauders do, target it, storm over to it, the Marauders just target Unit 2, and then force leap to it. Very, very easy to switch targets, really, so it's going to be easy in fights like that. Whether fights like Underlurker might help us out as well. The tank is getting an interesting one. Apparently they're going to be able to switch places with someone. That's going to be used for trolling. I don't really see where it could be useful. Maybe in PvP. I mean, PvP certainly could be useful. You get a bunch of people ganging up on the healer and you just switch places, and all of a sudden, yeah, you were hitting that squishy healer, and then a big dick fucking Guardian, a big dick Vanguard, should we say, not a Guardian, showed up. Oh, you're gonna panic there in PvP. Imagine that. Big dick Vanguard shows up. You ain't gonna be messing with them anymore, of course. So yeah, I don't know where that's gonna be useful. Because again, a lot of people pointed out in fights that, you know, fights like Sword Squadron with a rapid fire, just pull someone you don't like in front of it. There you go. I don't know, Underlurker, you could switch places with a Scoundrel maybe, and you know, put the Scoundrel at the front, and you could use your dodge on that. So maybe that might be useful. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know where would you really want to use that, because the problem is you can't use it with the other tank because it's going to do a threat drop. Unless there's a utility that removes the threat drop, then you could do the tank swapping thing. So maybe that will happen. I don't know. I mean, they've put out the Trooper story, they'll put out the Bounty Hunter story, and then they'll put out the changes. That's the pattern that they're going through. So it is definitely next up is the Trooper Bounty Hunter changes. So we will look at the Powertech one. We'll look at the Powertech one first, because again, it's a consideration for a main in 4.0. It is a good consideration. I don't know, Vanguards, that's why we're kind of in two minds, because Vanguards tend to just be in two places. Vanguards, they're either OP and fucking awesome, or they're terrible, generally. The tank seems to be the most consistent of those, though. The tank just seems to always be welcome in a raid, and certainly if you're a Vanguard DPS, again, if you're raiding, again, you do decent DPS on the Vanguard, you get decent mobility, decent defensive abilities as well. Very good passive defensive abilities, especially in tactics as well. So again, a Vanguard in a raid, yeah, you want one. Essential, I would say, especially for fights like Underlurker where you're all kind of bunched up. And you really take advantage of those Sonic Rebounders. Bear in mind, Sonic Rebounders doesn't affect the Vanguard though, it doesn't affect the original person who uses them. It only affects the raid, but it is a really nice cooldown. It comes from your AoE taunt, okay, which if you're not a tank, is your threat dump. So you're going to use that. You're going to use that on, what's his face, Bulow as well, because you want to use your threat dump on Bulow generally. So it's very, very useful, the Vanguard. It is the Flavor of the Month class. And it was probably the star performer overall in terms of PvE and PvP in Shadow of Revan. Wasn't the highest parsing spec. Some people argue, say, oh, it wasn't the highest parsing spec. But please, we live in the real world when we play this. I play most of the stuff I talk about is stuff that's in the real world. In a real world situation, in a raid boss, in a PvP environment, in most PvE environments, the Vanguard was generally the top spec in terms of not just its numbers, but in terms of its overall utility and its mobility and its survivability. The Vanguard had all of those things going for it. It wasn't just about standing there hitting a dummy, because Virulence is a very good spec, it is very good damage, but if you don't have the uptime for Virulence, or you can't get the uptime on a target because you have to move for certain conditions, of course, like Sword Squadron, you get grenades and circles on the ground, it does lose damage, it does lose out in those kind of real world conditions. So yeah, it's the top parsing spec currently in the game on the targeting dummy, but the Vanguard in a sort of real raiding environment where shit's going down and there's circles to get out of and there's ads to kill and there's all sorts of shit going down, the Vanguard really does excel. So I know someone will mention that in the video. So anyway, but that is all for this video. So next up, we'll take a look at the Gunslinger, shall we? We'll take a look at that Gunslinger and a world of complaints we have about the Gunslinger. But anyway, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again soon, and goodbye.